welcome everyone. I'm Alan Van Egmond, and on behalf of the Center for Critical Thinking, on which I am the board, we'd like to welcome everyone to a webinar today, which is very serious and very current on the rise of militias and violent extremism in America. And we're very pleased and honored to have Mark Albrecht here join us as the presenter and the speaker. I'll serve as the moderator, and we'll be having a presentation with slides for a bit and then open the floor for questions, which you can pose through the Q&A box on the lower right-hand side of your screen. Before we introduce Mr. Albrecht, the Center for Critical Thinking has some other programs that are coming up that we'd like you to know about. Next week on February 23rd, there'll be a webinar which will be a second part of a series on Black Lives Matter and introducing the question of police reform and defunding the police. And then the following webinar in the latter part of the week on the 26th of February will be addressing how to develop and how to proceed with strengthening critical thinking skills among today's students, particularly at the primary and secondary school level. And then in March, we'll have webinars on income inequality in America. We'll be introducing one of our board members who's just published a mystery novel, and we'll be talking about environmental challenges. And then at the end of March, we'll have the president of the Florida Gulf Coast University speak to us about the impact of COVID-19 on American higher education. So without further ado, just to let you know, we are recording this webinar. So those of us who may not be able to be able to sit in for the full length of time, or may want to have friends be able to see the webinar at a later point. It'll be posted on the YouTube channel and on the Center for Critical Thinking's website. The subject that we're discussing is very much of concern to many of us. Some may have noted that last week the American Enterprise Institute released a survey, results of a survey that they conducted, showing that politically motivated violence could potentially seem to have a significant share of US public support. The survey found that 3 in 10 Americans, including 39% of respondents who identified themselves as Republicans, agreed that, quote, if elected leaders will not protect America, the people must do it themselves, even if it requires violent actions. Now, militias themselves are not necessarily new to the United States of America. As a matter of fact, there are various forms of militias which are sanctioned and have been sanctioned throughout our history, including the nation's first organized fighting force, which originated on December 13th, 1636 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And the original 3 Massachusetts regiments continue to operate today. So what are we really talking about here, and what's really happening as we see the formation of groups like Proud Boys and many others as well? So turning to our speaker, you've seen his biography and the e-blast that we've sent out and other materials. Mr. Albrecht has included 30 years of consulting with many firms and has led a number of groups, including a software company called Talent Management Solutions. He's been a frequent speaker on many subjects, and this is one that he's been speaking on most recently, and appeared in several, he's written in several industry publications as well. He holds an MA in psychology from Montclair State College and an MBA in operations management from Boston University. Mr. Albrecht, thank you for joining us and welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you very much. It is an important topic, certainly on the mind of many Americans as we've seen on the news lately. It's one of the most important items that we've seen. I'm going to just describe a definition of militia versus vigilante groups and some of the justification that people use for citing that a militia is something that is supported by the Constitution. A militia is basically a private group that operates sort of a paramilitary force motivated by either political or religious ideology, typically to defend individual rights and often in opposition to government authority. Vigilante groups are, as we know, something more on the order of those who would band together at a particular point in time when they feel their redress, issues that they are protesting or whatever are not being addressed, and so vigilantes perhaps try to take law into their own hands. That is not what we're talking about. Although some of the actions, we see on news are kind of hard to decide exactly what kind of violent actions we're referring to. When people cite that militias are supported by the Constitution, they're usually referring to the Second Amendment. It's written here, it's a very brief statement, a well-regulated militia being necessary to secure in a free state the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So the only part dealing with the militia is the first half. And all it is referring to is a well-regulated militia, but it's referring to it in the context of supporting the state. Just to show the change in thinking over time, militias were originally started when there wasn't that much of a funded federal army. And today, of course, there is an army. In fact, in 1903, the Dick Act decided to incorporate all militias into the National Guard. And so that is, in essence, our citizens' body that is able and ready to be activated when needed in times of war or some kind of military action. But you'll see that the third bullet says all 50 states actually have laws prohibiting militias and their activities. And the Supreme Court in 2008 did affirm gun rights for personal use, but not for use by militia groups per se. But they also affirmed that states have the right to restrict militia activities. So that's a very important legal point about whether militia activities are legal or not. The analysis from Mary McCord from the Georgetown University on the Constitutional Protection Institute says that both the presence and action of militia groups at recent protests, in essence, are a violation of state laws. And the Second Amendment protection is essentially a mythology that has been popularized by the NRA. All right, so the FBI does have a definition of domestic terrorism, but as I said, we do not have laws that allow punishment of any kind in terms of what we do with international terrorists. And there's been resistance to labeling anyone in the U.S. as a domestic terrorist. But as we'll see, over time, there have been many more terrorist type of attacks in the U.S., and these show that there were, between 1994 and 2020, there were almost 900 terrorist attacks of different kinds. Of course, some are labeled as right-wing attacks, left-wing attacks, perhaps a religious affiliation behind the attack, those kinds of things. But what this shows on the right-hand side is a growing amount of, in the blue line, right-wing ideology behind most of the attacks. And you can see that the number of attacks has been increasing. Uh, in, in this chart, it shows a little bit different. These are percentage, and you can see the distribution in terms of the light blue color is again still the right wing, and the dark green is the left wing kind of ideology. The ideology of left wing violence has mostly in 2000 and 2005 timeframe been around animal research or some sort of eco ideology. But we can see that this percentage of the attacks is growing for right-wing oriented attacks. I do want to differentiate, by the way, what we're referring to is not political ideology. I'm not talking about Republican or Democratic. We're talking about far-right extremist kind of opinions. There is an association over time with the various presidential timeframes. As you can see, there's more left-wing violence when a Republican, Bush, was in office, and when Obama was elected, the rise started in terms of right-wing violence and has continued going up through the Trump administration. I'm just going to skip that one for time. We lost a little time. Militias describe themselves today in a little bit more palatable language. They refer to themselves often as patriots or nationalistic focus. Some refer to the constitutional militia, which gives justification for, in their mind, having having a county sheriff be the sole determinant of law on the local level. That, however, was disbanded, in right around the turn of the century, 1900s. So that is no longer constitutional. And then, of course, we have white supremacists as well as neo-Nazi groups in terms of their ideology behind militias. Some of the things that have caused a rise include in the 60s, the civil rights demonstrations caused a reaction from white power groups. So in the 17s, we saw a lot more banding together and recruitment for the different militias and Klan activity, that sort of thing. An interesting observation from several academics was that war, like the Vietnam War, actually caused people in general to be more tolerant of violent action. And so there are more people joining militias after a war, like when some of the troops come home. Of course, people before the internet were still talking and recruiting with early technology on the internet, on computers for message boards. So that's been a popular trend for a long time. And then there were different events. I mean, there's been so many events, I couldn't list them on 6 slides, but, Ruby Ridge, we're talking about people who were arguing against the government for basic freedom to do whatever they want in the open Western country of the United States. Waco, Texas, we know about the Branch Davidian siege. But after each of these events, the Oklahoma City bombing, after all of these events, there's a spike in militia formation and recruitment. So it seems only natural that after things like Charlottesville, when a lot of the Unite the Right KKK or other militia groups banded together to talk more openly about their philosophy, they're basically trying to change the dynamic of the conversation and make it more acceptable to talk about their opinions. And then when George Floyd died, the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, once again caused a reaction where militia groups started demonstrating alongside them and in opposition to them. But one thing that people often didn't know was that militia groups most recently have become very political. If you see just generally the trend has been for Republican ideology to get more conservative in this chart, growing from 58% to 73% over a couple of decades. Democrats getting more liberal, and on 4 different topics. In this case, you see a great divide between the different beliefs of voters on either the Republican or Democratic side in terms of racial difficulties. The second item being immigration and its impact on us, Islamophobia, and just basically in terms of women's rights. So there's a great divide recently in terms of some of these opinions. These have given rise to what we refer to as the Alt-Lite, alternative right. And what they describe themselves as is farther right than, as I said, any Republicans, even than the Tea Party. But they came up with their ideology based upon some of the themes I've been referring to in terms of what they refer to as Western nationalist culture, in which they believe that men should be men, women should be women, and that the different minorities, they didn't want a lot of immigration and all of that. So in essence, when Trump launched his 2016 presidential campaign, the militia groups actually started getting together with some of the Republicans, and specifically with Trump and some of the members of his team. You remember the Breitbart News was one of the ways in which some of these discussions were echoed and broadcast across the internet. The Proud Boys met in 2016 with Roger Stone, who was an advisor to Trump, and with Tucker Carlson. And you can see here that they've been meeting at the Republican National meeting room in both New York City and Washington, D.C. Ever since 2016. Steve Bannon was also very much involved with some of the philosophy. He worked with Richard Spencer, who is ahead of the alt-right, if you will, from a speaker's perspective. He goes around the country speaking to right-wing groups or at colleges to recruit people. And he's been doing this with Breitbart publishing some of their ideology around the web. Expanding social media has also caused an increase in some of this white supremacist kind of ideology. But these people have been strategists for Donald Trump. Stephen Miller, who was his senior policy advisor, specifically wrote all the legislation for immigration. He fed information to Katie McHugh in the third bullet at Breitbart News, so that those articles would be published supporting the argument he's making about race and immigration. And so he helped focus President Trump's policies throughout his term, because Stephen Miller has been a large influence on the entire administration. Richard Spencer and Stephen Miller also worked with Jared Taylor, who is a thought leader from American Renaissance, which is very much a conservative nationalist let's say, thought leader kind of journal. It's a basic journal for very conservative opinions. Michael Flynn was former national security advisor. We all know that he was out for a while after the Russia investigation, but he's back. You see him at the Capitol demonstration, and the reason he's back is because he swore allegiance to QAnon and was highly involved in the Stop the Steal campaign, etc. And so all of these characters participated in terms of turning the dialogue radically towards the far right agenda. So who are the far right? These are people who basically want to change the definition of political correctness. They don't want to have to restrain their speech because they know if they are not able to talk openly about racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and misogyny, they can't get their views into policy. And they've been taking a very active advocacy role, whereas extremist groups or militias didn't used to do advocacy. They basically organized to keep their discipline in place. They basically were looking for individual rights as the only agenda item for most of them. Well, we've got two kinds here. We've got the Alt-Lite, which is a short for alternative. As I said, they're very far right. They want to inject explicit racism and anti-Semitism, etc., back into politics, and they're very much skewing on a younger audience, and they believe in promoting radical or more violent actions in the real world, not just on the internet. Alt-Right tries to say they are different, more politically correct, by saying they do not explicitly embrace white supremacist ideology, but most of them do, and it's on record. They are just trying to look different, if you will, to look more acceptable. I'm going to refer to a couple of different of the individuals that we're talking about, because I'm going to turn to the militias in a second. But Richard Spencer, as I said, is one of the leaders who has specifically promoted at many organizations, many speeches, many marches, and at colleges trying to talk about the subject. Jared Taylor on the bottom is that American Renaissance Journal, and also he's part of this New Century Foundation think tank. And so these are some of the people that espouse the ideology. We also have the alt-right. There's a few people from there. And now these are saying they're more acceptable, but here's one example. Jack Posobiec is a Washington reporter, at least he was under the Trump administration. He was accepted into the White House briefing room because he is from Rebel Media. Now that's from Canada, and he's referred to as the king of fake news. One of the things he's noted for doing is impersonating a Democrat at a protest rally to walk around with a sign saying "Rape Melania." And of course, his only reason for doing so was to cause some sort of outrage. And you've got Mike Chernovich down below, who has very extreme views, not only about anti-Semitism, but also about women. He wants to teach women to stop lying about rape because he thinks there's no such thing as date rape. So these are rather extreme views, is what I'm saying. Kyle Chapman on the right, he's a member of the Proud Boys. In fact, he's a leader of what they refer to their alt-right military wing. They call him the based stick man because he has been seen at many demonstrations with a billy club, if you will, 6 feet long that he uses to hit Antifa or other demonstrators. So let's turn and look at some of the militias. First of all, they say they support a lot of different topics. Confederate monuments, Bill of Rights, First Amendment, Second Amendment, anti-tax. Some of them have said they support Black Lives Matter. Most of them have been protesting the protesters. And they recently picked up the subject of lockdown and decided to protest that. A lot of this is just to be out there protesting and getting their message seen. And the old idea of militias being survivalists, that they're much more activist now. They're actually looking for American Revolution 2, or you've also heard the theme Civil War 2, and that tells you quite directly what they're interested in. So militias have grown on the back of social media. You see, this is a little dated. I don't have a more current chart. No one's published one recently that I found, but through 2016 and 17, you see at certain times there's a spike in racial slurs that starts growing around the 2016 election. Around the inauguration of Trump, it reaches a peak. And then at the Charlottesville Unite the Right march, it has another peak. And of course, that march ended in tragedy with the death of a woman and a number of injuries. And so these are examples of how social media not only increases the posting, but what we see is a recruitment and people joining after these peaks, joining these militias as well. These are just some examples from the Unite the Right rally, which they were primarily using as a freedom of speech demonstration. After that rally, we had a spike over different terms. When you see on the two charts here, the top one shows the month of May, when George Floyd died at the hands of an accident with a policeman. The spike in terms that you see in the middle of the page were seen on the internet, a very large spike, and black reference on Telegram on the bottom one, also around George Floyd's death. And so these events trigger militia groups to respond. The Proud Boys is basically referred to as an alt-Lite. I would say they're really alt-right. They're not less violent at all anymore, but they espouse violence, misogyny, Islamophobia, anti-immigration. But they have several members, including Kyle Chapman, who are also anti-Semitic. But this is Kyle on the right, bottom right, with his stick hitting a protester at a Black Lives Matter rally. So these are some examples early on, and I'm sure everyone has seen more about the Capitol riot recently. But, all of these militia groups have a number of members who have an arrest record. And so Kyle Chapman, for example, I know he's been arrested and charged about 4 or 5 times. He seems to get dismissed or no jail time on all of them so far. Maybe he did, I think, a small amount of jail, like 6 months or something in one case. But the punishment seems to be rather light for militia members. The Boogaloo movement originally was describing itself as an umbrella organization for multiple militias. That hasn't been accepted by all militias. Certainly they have a lot of different ideologies, so they don't exactly all work together. But the Boogaloo movement has people of a variety of ideologies. They explicitly say they are not anti-Semitic. They have appeared at protests in support of Black Lives Matter. However, they've also, in some cases, protested police and authority as well, and in some cases say they support police, but most of the time the Boogaloo members are anti-police in terms of their actions at demonstrations. The next group you probably heard about from the Capitol riot are the Oath Keepers. Now, the Oath Keepers are a little unique in that they primarily recruit ex-military and law enforcement personnel. They do this because they say they are upholding the oath, the constitutional oath that they had as military members themselves. However, their agenda is often anti-government. They are specifically seeking an overthrow, and indeed with the Capitol riot, were there to cause an overthrow of the vote. And even if that became something other than a democracy, they were looking for a change in the government. And they we're seeing here in a couple of examples in Ferguson or in Albuquerque. In the first case at Ferguson, they were saying they were there just to protect citizens. Later on, they're not there to protect citizens anymore. They were fighting the citizens. The 3%ers, this name means, it dates back to what they referred to as patriotic overthrow of tyranny, like in the U.S., theoretically was done by, the 1776 War of Independence was theoretically only 3% of the population, is what they're saying. And so that is all they need in order to achieve their goals. And they were popular for a while at protest movements. There were some at the Capitol riot, and they, are basically looking for that Revolutionary War as well. Now, if you remember a while back in Michigan, there was a plot against Governor Gretchen Whitmer. These are the people who were from a militia which was a part of the Boogaloo movement, but they were the Wolverine Watchmen. And all of these were arrested because they had a plot to kidnap, interrogate, and perhaps kill Gretchen Whitmer. In addition, they were seeking 200 men to storm the state capitol, and were going to try the governor for treason. So these are all in jail. The leader of that group is indicated with the arrow. But fortunately, the FBI decided to take action based upon their online threats and planning. There are also a number of militias of the type you may be familiar with from history, from the White Knights of the Royal Ku Klux Klan, but I'm not going to go over all of those. Those are essentially white supremacist organizations. There are even international groups that communicate with some of our U.S. domestic militias so that they share ideology, share plans. They even got together in Germany for a meeting to plan how to grow their ranks over the past 4 years. One of the articles I sent out for you being referred to the fact that law enforcement has failed to recognize militias as a threat to our domestic security. I just want to say the first bullet point here. In March of 2009, an FBI agent, Johnson, wrote a report which very clearly showed the rising threat of radical white supremacist organizations. And he submitted that to the Department of Homeland Security. What happened was the radio host, Roger Redcock, leaked that. The Oath Keepers militia posted it on the internet. John Boehner started protesting that you can't call American citizens right-wing extremists. And so Janet Napolitano, the DHS head, had to apologize and withdraw the report. That became evidence of the deep state, and Time tried to play it down by starting a program he called Countering Violent Extremism. He didn't call it right wing, and he was referring to trying to do education to decrease the amount of rhetoric and the violence on the internet and in public life associated with extremism. That, of course, as soon as President Trump was in office, he ended that program that Obama had started. And the second article I sent was titled "Extremists and Mainstream Trump Supporters Plan to Protest the Certification of Biden's Victory." In this case as well, there was notice in advance of the planning for either March on the Capitol or the rallies that were going to go on. There were 4 permits filed for 6 rallies for the day before. Most of these already. The Stop the Steal Wild protest was organized by Alexander, a right-wing provocateur. The Trump March at the Freedom Plaza was organized by Amy Kremer, who is a founder of Republican Alt-Lite kind of information, and she's founder of Women for America First. And then there were a couple of other rallies there as well, the MAGA Wild, etc. But the last one, Operation Occupy the Capitol, was an explicit rally that was requested and promoted on social media for something like 20 days in advance of it. This article I recommended to you was from ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, who sent this information to the FBI in advance, and we're referring to some of this online chatter about storm the Capitol. Some of the chatter says, "My truck is lifted and I have a plow on it, so what do you need, Mr. President?" Etc. You can see some of the other comments on that. So in advance, the following, these are just some of the militias that planned in advance for storming the Capitol. The Groyper Army, this one is very militaristic, and they were explicitly saying kill state legislators. The Proud Boys announced that they would be attending. In fact, they were saying that they have plans for having heavy armaments available to cross the Potomac to fight some of the Antifa who would show up. As far as I know, there were no Antifa there. Oath Keepers, who planned initially saying that they were going to provide security and undercover teams in DC for those 2 days. But of course, they did more than just security. I'm sure you've seen footage of them entering the Capitol itself. In fact, they entered the Capitol with military gear on and with walkie-talkies so that they can communicate as military troops do. So then the third article was our president wants us here. I'm not going to go over all the Capitol footage. I'm sure everyone's seen it. I've mentioned some of the rallies, and just the fact that these took place in the context of militia groups coming explicitly thinking they're doing the bidding of the president to take the Capitol. This just is a statement about how directly involved in not just activism, but direct party planning on their part anyway, on the part of the militias, in terms of actions against the government. So after the Capitol riot, the FBI is now arresting, I think they've arrested over 250 people based on information that was publicly posted on social media and people observed by cameras around the Capitol building. But these are the Proud Boys who were arrested and charged with conspiracy. You see that the ones on the left were specifically the ones involved in the planning. And conspiracy is not an easy crime to prove or to charge. And so that's a pretty high level that they say they have information on their coordination in advance. And indeed, the one from the right who went along as their. So there are at least 21 from this group. The Oath Keepers also planned the Capitol siege. Stuart Rhodes is the founder. He's the one on the left. He is a disbarred Yale lawyer. He promoted warfare and said his most skilled veterans were going to be armed and outside the Capitol. Then we have Jessica Watkins on the lower left, who was seen many times on film inside the Capitol. She's using the Zello, Z-E-L-L-O, walkie-talkie app to communicate with her co-leader, Donovan Krall. These are people from Ohio branch of the Oath Keepers. And so they planned caravans and buses and other forms of transportation. And these, Jessica and Donovan both helped provide funding and coordinated individuals from other militias coming to the Capitol as well. So it wasn't just those keepers. They worked with the 3 Percenters. They worked with the North Carolina militia as well, and tried to just get as many people there as they could to participate. These are the ones that were charged. Again, you see on the top right, the 3 I've mentioned were charged with conspiracy for the actions I've said. And then some additional ones, which I'm sure you've seen these pictures on the bottom left, because these were taken from all the press stories about the taking of the Capitol. So one of the things that I find a little bit of a disconnect is when you see the militias saying one thing and doing another. There have been many times when, over the years, they've come out in support of the police to either protest or attack people in the Black Lives Matter movement. And in this case, you see a flag here with a blue stripe in it. That flag is a statement of support for police. And yet here it is being shown at the Capitol riot with a militia person trying to beat police officers in the Capitol Police or the Metropolitan Police with that very flag. And, so you can see what their objective is is their goals, whatever those may be. Overthrow the government, Civil War II, Revolutionary War II, whichever way you want to say it. But they unfortunately caused a lot of injuries of the police, and the police, although they are now also looking at whether some of the Metropolitan Police or some of the federal troops may have had some sympathizers in the crowd. That's been around for a while. Interestingly, the Proud Boys now are saying that after this Capitol riot, that Trump is a total failure. They wanted him essentially to invoke martial law and to, as they call it, cross the Rubicon and become an emperor, according to this statement. This is what has been posted on the internet by the Proud Boys after the failure of the Capitol siege. Well, it was successful, but it didn't go anywhere. It didn't achieve the goal they wanted. And they say Trump will go down as a failure in history. They are upset because Trump did not pardon them or keep them from prosecution. And shortly after the Proud Boys made this statement, it was followed by Oath Keepers, 3%ers, America First, et cetera, as they are saying, he didn't meet their expectations. So that basically kind of says their support was not so much for a particular Democratic president, but for their views, even if that's emperor instead. They basically wanted to overthrow our democratic government. As Alan said at the beginning, there are differences in views now after the election. I said what some of the militia groups now were thinking. And then from Pew Research, this is some of the result you mentioned earlier at the beginning. The percentage of people who say that it's very important to the country that people are free to peacefully protest. You can see on the left that Democrats are holding constant at about 82%. Republicans, that has gone down, meaning that they don't think it's as important that people are allowed to peacefully protest. On the right, it says, how well does this describe the country? Very or somewhat well. And in this case, the percent of people who say that this already is describing our country very well, Republicans say, yeah, we're allowed to. We don't have to do anything more, if you will. 80% say that it already describes this well. And the Democrats more think this is eroding. And so this just points to the fact that there have been a lot of protests. We're protesting really now. I am the first to say there's been a lot more violence than is acceptable at demonstrations. It's in the Constitution that we're allowed, the First Amendment says we're allowed to peacefully protest. It's in the First Amendment. And yet it has gone far beyond that from both left and right sides. And that's kind of the state of where we are today. The figure that Alan read to you earlier is shown here, a survey of the perspectives in 2020 of two statements. One, the traditional American way of life is disappearing so fast that we have to use force to save it. All Americans, you can see 60% disagree with that. 36% agree that we have to use force to save it. And the distinction is that Republicans are a larger percentage, 55% support. 22% of Democrats support that. The second sentence, if elected leaders, this is the one Alan read to you, if elected leaders will not protect America, the people must do it themselves, even if it requires taking violent actions. As you see, all Americans, 68% disagree, but of Republicans, a rather large number, 39%, agree in taking violent actions, 31% of independents, and 17% of Democrats. So that's a lot of Americans that have come to accept a certain level of violence as a part of the course for espousing our views or fighting for our views. I was surprised at some of the terminology used over the past 4 years for political campaigns. Fight for this, fight for that. Army for Trump was the website to volunteer to work on the Trump campaign in 2020. There's just a rhetoric change from, let's say, 8 years ago that does impact, I think, actual behavior in the real world. So I'm going to break in a moment for questions. Alan, if there's going to be some questions from the audience, any items you want to discuss. But just a couple of more slides. What does the research show on terrorism? It shows that democracies are not, cannot avoid domestic terrorism. Not international terrorism, domestic terrorism. There's nothing unique about a democracy that protects it. Why? Because certain groups are always going to feel disenfranchised when we have such disparate beliefs or opinions. What can we do about it? These are some general statements. They are not specific policy actions, but protecting participation, helping get people more opportunity and prevent radicalization. That sounds a little bit more like we're used to hearing about ISIS, but we need to think about how to translate that to U.S. citizens. I don't know. Preserving human rights, perhaps lowering the rhetoric. I don't know. But it is going to take a coalition of people. This is not a simple thing to change. Jonathan Greenblatt from the Anti-Defamation League just a week ago testified before the House based upon the Capitol riot, made some recommendations. I'll just share those with you. He says we need to pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act that was proposed last year in 2020 by the House, and of course it sat with no action from the Senate. That would allow the FBI to track and monitor, in fact it would require them to, and to report to Congress about the level of domestic terrorism of all kinds, not right-wing, all kinds, and to educate police enforcement on terrorism's actions and on the threat of terrorism so they know what to do. Today, no one is actually publishing what I've just shown you, which is some of the people involved in terror incidents. That isn't provided to our police departments. ADL does now conduct training for a lot of different law enforcement agencies around the country, but there is no common government database to track people like we do with international terrorists. So this is why he's calling for a Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. In addition, hate speech that we see all over the web pass the No Hate Act, so law enforcement has a better idea how to deal with hate crimes, to stop politicizing hate, deal with social media, and hold them more accountable, and even to consider international supremacist or other paramilitary organizations who do communicate with us and our militias in the U.S. To hold them accountable and also perhaps designate them as foreign terrorist organizations. So these are some steps that are being proposed in terms of political action. He makes a point that Americans are not more hateful, but there are people out there trying to normalize hate speech. And that is one of the problems that causes an increase in violent actions like this. Alan, you want to ask the question?
Well, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion. There's a lot to unpack here. I suspect we're going to need to have a follow-on in the coming weeks to come back to some of these points that you've made. We've gotten a lot of questions, so I'll do my best to pose them in ways that capture the essence of what folks are asking. Of course, one of the things you've just pointed to is through social media and other our work of our politicians. Are we starting to normalize not only hate speech but hateful behavior? I remember still vividly today the Oklahoma City bombing and how many children in the nursery were killed and how many people died in that tremendously impressive explosion. And as a former government official, I just could not absorb that tragedy at that point. But domestic terrorism goes back a ways, and certainly in the mid-90s when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, that was certainly a very dramatic act of domestic terrorism. So the first question is, you've mentioned something that's kind of almost counterintuitive, that of course militias resurged during the Obama administration, as one point you made, but then the question would be, well, what about left-wing violence under Trump? I mean, is there a significant threat from far-left militias as well, or is it mainly far-right militias? And why, if it's true, why did left-wing violence not increase substantially under President Trump?
It's a very good question. The type of left-wing violence has been somewhat different. It is not anti-Semitic. It is not white supremacist. It is not any of the things we've been talking about. I mentioned just briefly that it is a bit more focused. It has been on several things. Now, this is tracking the incidence of left-wing violence from FBI database and also from the Southern Poverty Law Center that shows that it has been more eco-terrorism. It has been animal rights groups not wanting to experiment on animals for our safety, and also for abortion. Those are the three most popular subjects, and that has gone both ways, people on both sides of those issues. And so they're emotional issues. There's also a little bit on climate activism. People are familiar with that from 20 years ago. But that climate activism has waned recently. And in fact, the reason why you see a rise in left-wing violence during a Republican administration is perhaps the same thing I mentioned. They feel their issues are not being addressed. And so it goes both ways. There are extreme opinions on one side or the other. And when the administration that seems to have counter opinions or policies is in office, there's a resurgence. But I'll say this, the level of violence from the left side is dramatically different than the violence from a right-hand side of that equation, if you will. And that's just a part of their philosophy. They don't believe in violence in terms of murder. So there's far fewer murders, if you will. The one question you might add, Antifa. Antifa, let me just click a different slide, sorry. Here, Antifa is essentially a group that started in Europe as a reaction to Nazi Germany and their policies. And they are anti-fascist in ideology. Their sole purpose is to fight white supremacists. They have finally decided it is not enough to sit back, because when Hitler came to power, it was a small majority. No, it was a minority. It was a very few amount of people that actually supported Hitler's rise to power. And yet he fought within, not against the government, to take over and make those dramatic changes to Germany. But so Antifa is basically seeing the rise in anti-Semitism and white supremacy in the U.S., and they have come out to fight it. That is explicitly why they have shown up. The fact that they are more aggressive is that they believe they have to push hard back at the individual people, the white supremacists. They are not the Black Lives Matter people who were breaking buildings or lighting a fire in a trash can. They are people who are at a protest to push back at white supremacists or militia members. And that is all they're there for. I mentioned some of the statistics earlier. You can see I've got the statistics here for two different time frames, since 1994 and since 2010. And so since 1994 includes 2010 figures, if you understand. But this is saying for left-wing violence, there are only 21 victims killed since 2010, but for right-wing violence, 117. This chart gives you a bit of a figure on that difference, if you will. And that's the best I can say. I don't
Thank you. No, that's very, it's very helpful. So another cluster of questions relates to folks who are part of these militias. What percentage are women? To what extent are active duty police and active duty military participating in militias in these groups sort of in their spare time? We know that some folks have retired from the military and from the police and joined these groups, but there's also an indication that even active duty police and military are doing this, are participating.
Yes, indeed. I would say that I've heard figures, we don't know how many explicitly, but I've heard figures that perhaps 20% of some of the militias are either active police or military. Active. And that's only of some militias. As I said to you, some of the militias are different. A white supremacist militia would not probably be that way. But Oath Keepers, as I said, is predominantly made up of law enforcement and military. However, some of them are retired. The other point is you do have police who are actively collaborating. Even some county officials. I remember one county official in Nevada was requested to recall him, to ask him to resign, whatever, because he supported violence and was essentially talking about planning the Capitol siege ahead of time. And, you know, he's their local police officer, county police. And, you know, so it is a problem. The military estimates that they have sympathies. I'm not saying they're members, but they have sympathies for either racial or anti-Semitic ideology fairly high as well, and they're going to have to deal with it.
So, and this was sort of a preview of what may be coming up when we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, but some folks have made the observation that there was a variability in the way that the police and the Capitol related to the mob. Some appeared to be doing their utmost to resist the mob and to you know, and to be quite in a heroic fashion protecting the lives of our leaders and on the Hill, and then others didn't seem to be quite as motivated to do so. So that's a little bit scary. Next question relates to the number of people. I mean, how big are these groups? Do you estimate? And again, if you could just circle back, I don't think I heard a response to the percentage or to the number that are women. So how big are these groups, and what percentage of the population? Is it just a minuscule percentage, or are we seeing a fairly significant percentage who not only are part of these groups but associated with them?
So women are a very small part of militia groups. They're predominantly men, predominantly white. There is one black militia that I'm aware of, and it's an all-black militia. A couple of black people are a part of the Boogaloo movement. Women, there are a handful as a part of the Boogaloo movement. There are some Oath Keepers. I showed you that one woman who is one of the leaders there. One of the leaders of the Portland rally and several of the ongoing demonstrations with Black Lives Matter. The person promoting the chatter on the internet was a woman who was organizing all the activity, and all the men were taking direction from her, which is a very odd phenomenon. You don't see that because most of them are extremely male-dominated in terms of their leadership or in terms of their ideology. But the size of militias ranges from 20 to 200. The ones I've mentioned are the larger ones, around 200 countrywide. But there's a national militia website. It used to be something I could log into. It is no longer something I can log into. You have to be invited. But that particular website is a way for people to start their own militia, set its website up, recruit members, and affiliate with other militia members across the country, sort of as a marketplace, if you will. So, you know, it's getting more organized, and with those techniques, they are able to grow. They are all doing recruitment at colleges over the past 4 years as well.
So let me just take another question that relates to this one, but specifically relative to our state of Florida here. How active is the militia movement locally and in our state? Are they related to the major gangs in the U.S., or is it a different phenomenon altogether?
So I'm afraid there's too many items on this page for you to read, but there are 68 current militia hate groups in Florida, and they're in every different state. And there is actually a map that people can see that is from either ADL or from the southern part of the law center, which allows you to see how many and where they're located. And that is this map. And from this, you see that in the US, the number of groups grew from 599 in 2000 to 838 around that today. I would argue there's more than that today. In Florida, I said it's now gotten up to 68. So this shows you where they're located. It doesn't say the size, but if you go to one of those sites, either from ADL, it's ADL.com, I'm sorry, .org, or you go to Southern Poverty Law Center, which is SPLcenter.org, and they both have this kind of map where you can drill down and see how many there are in your area.
Well, that's very helpful. Thank you. I didn't quite realize that there are so many groups in Florida operating, but 68 sounds like a fairly substantial number to me at this point. Going on to some other questions, the whole concept of free speech, it seems like some of these groups have wrapped themselves around the First Amendment. And of course, there are standards about not crying fire in a theater or doing things that are going to endanger people. But there seems to be a sense of, well, if I want to say something, I absolutely have the right to do it, despite the impact or the type of effects that it might have. And then in that context, if we proceed with a stronger domestic terrorism law, won't that, I mean, I guess the question, I'll just repeat it as is provided, is what good and bad will a domestic terrorism law do? And then I would add to that, particularly vis-a-vis the First Amendment.
Well, so first of all, the First Amendment is here, referring to the fact that Congress, from a federal perspective, cannot do anything to prohibit free speech or the press or the right of people to peaceably assemble and protest. So that is all it says. Of course, it's been interpreted many times. It's complex. It does make a problem for talking about either political speech or, if you will, far-right speech. It does make that a problem. And all I can say is, this is only talking primarily about speech, not violent threats. So hate crimes are a crime on the books in most states, and also something punishable. And so what we need to do is to differentiate better between legislation for terrorism versus hate speech or hate crimes versus things like stalking on the internet. I mean, all of these are very gray areas, and we do have to deal with them in more detail. Positive and negative, sure, we all want to keep our rights of free speech, and in essence, I don't see that as being challenged. When it becomes incitement of violence, when it becomes threats, those things are punishable. What has been difficult in the context of the militia actions that have happened is that it has been hard for the FBI or for law enforcement to interpret our laws as they relate to domestic citizens. They don't know what to do. And this is why we need to clarify so that they know better how to respond to either hate speech, hate threats, or a militia threat. And so it is something that's very important for us to take on, but it is not going to be a simple solution.
Thank you. With your permission, we'll field a couple more questions. The comparison is made sometimes of the way these groups are operating, and the militia groups sort of echo their beliefs. There's a comparison made with the militias in Nazi Germany, the rise of the brown shirts and how they comported themselves. And related to that, have there been any useful, that you've seen anyway, psychological profiles of the members of these militias and what they're doing to help us better understand kind of what's going through their heads? Is it regarded as sort of a mental illness, one person asks?
I mean, that's a good question. There are a lot of university level programs studying terrorism. I get reports sent to me, sometimes 10 a day, published by academics on the subject. It's a very popular subject right now. They address all aspects of it, psychological profiles, etc. They also have suggestions for how to reduce militants, the radicalization of domestic people as well as the international. So it has come home. In essence, it is being studied in detail. I don't personally know from a psychological perspective, since we haven't been tracking people in detail from an FBI perspective, we don't have that kind of analysis on them. And certainly organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, NABL, are the ones that have been scoring it. One of the universities that is well known on this, they do a good job, is Georgetown University or Washington University. But Georgetown University is taking it more from a constitutional perspective. And so, there's a lot of good research being done. I haven't delved into it from that individual perspective. But from what most people would want to know, you can get a lot of information just from reading. I gave you a couple of slides earlier about the actual, some of the people involved. And these are very summary level. If you go to the ADL website, you can look up all of these militia leaders that they've been tracking and see what kind of people they are. There's an article on each one of these, not just the bullet points.
Sounds like a very useful website, the ADL website. So why don't we field one? Do we have time for one more question? Is that okay? I'll sort of merge a few questions that have been raised. But last year, the FBI director, Ray, testified that Antifa is an ideology, not an organization. Do you agree with this or disagree? And then ultimately, do you feel that these groups, without the leaders, let's say if some of the leaders were put in prison, would they disappear, or would they, like some of the other terrorist groups that we've seen overseas, whatever, they just have somebody come in back of them and sort of carry on as before?
Good questions. I would say from an Antifa perspective, they do act more like an organization, less like an organization with a particular goal in mind. There are certain individuals, of course, who have helped organize particular protests, and that is the way all protests occur. They have a leader of a protest or whatever, but those have been around protest movements. It hasn't been that Antifa has an agenda or a planning aside from some of the protests they want to participate in. And so they come out when there's something to support. There is one person who wrote the manifesto or the user manual, if you will, on Antifa. It is available online. That person's name is Mark Gray, B-R-A-E, I believe. And he wrote the book. that basically describes the lessons learned from Nazi Germany and the rise of Nazism, and how to promote fighting against that on your own, how to form your own protest against that. It is not something that they try to organize between people. And yes, I think if someone was arrested from Antifa, it's not going to make a dent in other people protesting, because it's a very well read book and it's a very well understood philosophy in that audience. Again, they're primarily younger people coming out to fight Nazism or white supremacy. On the other side, in terms of the militias, there's no way that arresting individuals is going to stop militia movement either. But I will say this, they are different in terms of character and in terms of longevity. They have been around for a long, long time. Many of them, what's troubling, I would say to me, is that there are many new ones, and I'm hoping they're not around just as long. And I'm talking about 50 years or more, some of them 100 years since the Civil War. But, you know, some of those are very individual based. The reason why there have been a lot of protests in Michigan is because they have historical leaders of that movement who have been promoting the ideology for a long time, writing books on it, etc. Same with Portland. They have a history there of white supremacist kind of mountain men, if you will, and they have protesters who have taken that to task from the opposite side. So the reason you see demonstrations in certain areas does depend on individuals, but if we took those people out, there's plenty of that around that it will remain. What you could do is to, in essence, slow the speed at which it goes on the internet and don't facilitate so much the interconnection between militias and people with that ideology. That is the direction I think could have a much bigger dent. But of course, when people commit crimes, they should be arrested and prosecuted.
Well, that raises a whole new sphere of discussion, which perhaps we should engage in a subsequent webinar, and that is the role of social media, the role of the press, and the role of leaders both in business and in the private sector and in government that would seem to empower in some ways the beliefs and the operations of these groups. One of the words or phrases that struck me at the very beginning of your presentation and your slides about the Second Amendment with respect to the right to bear arms and militias and form militias is well-regulated militias. Well-regulated. Well, it seems to me that that's been very much missing in the equation at this point. I don't think you could characterize most of the militias that we've seen, at least in recent years, as very well regulated, not regulated by the authorities in any event. So with that, let me thank you very much for covering a very important topic in a very knowledgeable way. Your slides, a number of people commented, were very well researched, and that's much appreciated. And so with that, I will say thanks to all who participated and attended this webinar, and stay tuned.